Welcome to our Trinity Clinical Speech webinar for February. As regular attenders will know, we've been hosting these clinical webinars monthly now. We had a bit of a break in early January, but we hope to continue for most of the year now. So please do look out for future notifications. So I'm really delighted to welcome our two speakers today, Dr. Ciarán Kenny and Dr. Chang-Jung Liu. And their topic is going to be vocal and communicative congruence in speech and language therapy. Does my voice belong to me? So what we'll do is go through the webinar. We're kind of estimating around about 40 minutes, which will leave us a few minutes for questions. If people want to put any questions into the Q&A via the button at the bottom, and then we can kind of cover as many of those as possible after the talk. But for now, I'll hand over to Ciarán and Liu. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. So maybe I'll start the sharing, Liu, if that's okay. Now, I think this should work. Please let me know if you can see the slides. You see that?
Yes.
Yep, great.
Yes,
okay.
We can, yep.
So thanks, Paul, for inviting us, and welcome everyone. As Paul said, my name is Ciarán. I'm a lecturer in clinical speech and language studies in Trinity. My areas of specialism are voice and swallowing disorders. And I had the pleasure over the last number of years of being supervisor for now Dr. Chang-Jung Liu, who did her PhD topic on vocal and communicative congruence specific to trans clients that we might see. But we're taking a slightly broader approach, and Liu will speak about her research with trans people later on in just a moment. But maybe, Liu, do you want to introduce yourself first and give us a bit of information about your background as well?
Well, I feel like you've introduced me very well. Yeah, I've just recently finished my PhD under Ciarán's supervision, so thank you, Ciarán. And well, I have to say, after 4 years of PhD researching vocal congruence with trans clients, I still have a very strong passion about this field. So I'm very excited to share this topic here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've just realized we've already done the next slide, which is introducing ourselves. So one thing I'll just say before we start as well is that Liu and I are both giving the presentation today, so we will have to stop and start sharing our screens as we alternate through the presentation. So just bear with us while we do that. So let's begin and think about what congruence is. So this topic might not be familiar for very many people who are watching the webinar. There are two definitions here. Vocal congruence is the extent to which one's voice is in alignment or congruent with one's sense of self. And then communicative congruence is how much a person's communication is consistent with their sense of self or sense of identity. So Liu's PhD was on vocal and communicative congruence. And I think the reason we put that in the title today as well is because congruence is not just about how your voice sounds, but it's about your entire communication style and your presentation of your communication to other people. And I think myself, it's something that we don't think a lot about as speech and language therapists. It's become increasingly more recognized in trans work, but I think it's still under-recognized in other areas of practice that we work in, and I'll give some examples of that in just a moment. So the concept is that congruence is something that a feeling that the way you are expressing yourself sits right with you. Your communication style represents your authentic self. And I think we've all been in situations where we felt incongruence in terms of our communication. Speaking from personal experience, as much as I might think I'm a great singer, when I hear myself when I'm doing karaoke or something with friends, I definitely get the ick there. Likewise, anytime any of us hear a recording back of ourselves, sometimes we think that doesn't sound like me at all. That's making me deeply uncomfortable. And then even when we're sick and that changes the quality of our voice, we can feel a sense of incongruence, like, oh, that doesn't sound like me. And sometimes we prefer how we sound when we're sick. Speaking for myself, I have a deeper voice that I like better when I'm sick, but it still doesn't sound like me. It doesn't It doesn't feel like it's me when I hear my voice back. So a sense of incongruence can give us this feeling of ick, I don't like it. It's not an easily defined feature. Incongruence in communication or in voicing is not any one thing. It's not our pitch, it's not our loudness, our resonance, the timbre of our voice. It's more than that when it comes to voicing. And it's even more than that again when it comes to communication, because communication goes beyond simply the sound of our voice or our speech patterns. It's therefore quite difficult to conceptualize and measure congruence as a concept. If I got everyone who's watching this to think for a moment about someone you've met who you'd be afraid to cross, the kind of person who you think I don't know how to say no to them, or I wouldn't like to get on their bad side, versus someone you know who you've met who shows great empathy. They have very different communication styles, and even without saying anything, that person might be conveying a sense of their personality or their self that you don't necessarily have to hear them say anything to understand what their personality is like. So in both instances, those people have the ability to communicate normally, but how they communicate is what conveys their personality. The reason I'm saying that is because it includes both verbal and non-verbal communication. And we as speech and language therapists, I think when we think about being person-centered with the types of clients that we work with, speaking for myself at least, what jumps into my mind is often, okay, think of the ICF framework, think of activity and participation limitations, make sure you're addressing what's going on in that person's life for them in terms of something they cannot do anymore with their voice or with their communication or with their swallowing abilities. But we don't, or I don't at least, often enough think about how does that person's personality or sense of self carry through in their communication style. And that can be verbally or non-verbally. When it comes to congruence, there's a concept that is very linked with congruence called interoception. And interoception is a mind-body awareness and link between the two. When I'm describing this to students who are about to see voice clients in particular, I often say that one of the determiners of success, in my opinion, as to whether someone responds very well to voice treatment or not, is how well tuned into their own body they are. If someone has a muscle tension voice disorder, but they don't realize that they're holding a lot of tension in their upper body, you can do all the voice exercises you want, but that person may not get better in terms of their communication because they're not aware that they're carrying that tension, and that tension that they are carrying is introducing problems to their voicing. So interoception is the ability of a person to have that mind-body connection. And I always say that I think the people who are best at that are the type of are people who maybe come to us for treatment who have already practiced yoga or meditation or something like that, built up those body awareness skills. And interestingly, a scale that we can use to measure congruence, called the vocal congruence scale, which I'll talk about in a moment, it looked at the relationship between interoception and congruence. And actually, it's been noted by the authors of that scale that people who have a greater extent or a greater degree of mind-body awareness and connection between the two are also people who have higher interoceptive abilities. So getting our clients to tune into how their body feels and how their body is responding to a given communication situation can be important for improving congruence. Yep, I've just said that. So all of this together suggests that congruence is not about external feedback or social judgment. There is a relationship between the two, I think. My sense of whether I communicate in a way that is authentic to me is not or should not be determined perhaps by how other people respond to my communication styles, though we have to acknowledge that some of how well our communication styles sit with us does depend on the feedback we get from our communication partners. And Lou, I know, will speak to that a little bit in her findings. But congruence is also certainly not reducible to acoustic or perceptual performance. So it's not the case that when someone is less dysphonic, they are more congruent, or It's not necessarily the case that when they are less dysphonic, they are more congruent, or that when the speech therapist thinks that their Grabas scale is normal or that their word finding difficulties have improved, that they are now congruent. Rather, congruence is linked with our internal self-monitoring and our bodily insight, and it's accessed by therapists with their clients through conversation, which I know Lou will have a lot to say about in just a moment. We can, however, measure it using a scale. So this is the vocal congruence scale that I mentioned earlier. A 10-item scale scored from 0 to 4. And how this was developed was that the authors got some people to speak and rate the scale, and then I think separately also listen back to their voice recording and rate the scale. And they had to answer these statements. Like, for example, in the task that I just listened to or performed, it seemed like my voice belonged to me, and how much they agreed with that statement or not. And clearly people who score lower on the vocal congruence scale have a lower sense of congruence in terms of feeling like their communication represents, their communication style really represents who they are as a person. Congruence can be a kind of an abstract concept, I think. So I was trying to think about how to make it something slightly more concrete today. And I enlisted the help of ChatGPT for this. So I was thinking, what if instead of seeing a speech therapist, I was seeing a stylist? And I said to the stylist, you know, I like to dress in sort of a slightly formal dress style, maybe not too formal, and ask them, you know, can you help me with my styling as opposed to my communication? And they come up with something like this. I like that ChatGPT gave me clearer skin, less red skin, and a squarer jaw. But if they came up with something like this, I wouldn't be too dissatisfied with my stylist. Because it still sticks with the original intent of how I like to express myself through how I dress. It could go worse. ChatGPT did a great job of turning me into a hippie. So that would make me feel certainly incongruent. And worse still, I think I would probably never leave the house if I dressed like this. That would make me feel deeply uncomfortable. And we are the stylists in this situation. The speech therapists are the stylists. We have within our power the ability to help people change their communication style, but we don't necessarily know whether the new way they are communicating suits them or not without asking that question in the first place. So just some examples of how this might apply to clients that some people listening might see. AAC users might be given supported communication that doesn't reflect their gender, their accent, or even what colloquialisms they use, whether that's regional or whether that's unique to that person. Laryngectomies, their original voice is missing. They may communicate through a tracheoesophageal voice prosthesis or use an electrolarynx. And one of our master students is looking at electrolarynx use and its relationship with communication comfort at the moment as her master's project. And clients with neurological diseases, you know, they may have prosodic impairments that don't allow them to express themselves as well as they used to be able to. And I think we probably encountered that, some of us in our work. People with Parkinson's who have a flatter communication style feel like they can't land jokes or express humor as well anymore. I did reflect as I was preparing the slides on whether speech therapists providing intervention could potentially make things worse. I don't know, is the answer. If we're working with clients with fluency difficulties, does the fluency modification work we do reduce their congruence? Does it feel less like themselves if we're trying to make them communicate in a style that's more conformative to normative ideas in society about what fluency should be like? If that's the approach we're taking in therapy, or younger clients with speech sound disorders or developmental language disorders, are we correcting personal markers of their speech? You know, do their family and their friends understand them? And then we start correcting those markers. And really, when I was reflecting on this, what it came down to was, I think as speech therapists, we need to find a balance between facilitating agency for our clients so that they can communicate in a way that suits them, but also allows them to interact with the world in a sensible way that works for them without taking away their own personal sense of self while we do so. So some reflective points I wanted to pause and think about for a moment, or for everyone listening to pause and think about for a moment. I think it would be useful to think, do I in my clinical practice ever think about congruence with the clients that I see? And if you do, whose judgment counts here? How much do I give the power to the client to think about their own sense of congruence versus how much am I perhaps working with normative data, which we do a lot of, and trying to get this client to adjust to what is considered normal? I think the practical reality is that we often are not trained to think about congruence. It was a new concept to me, really until Lou started doing her PhD and educated me on the topic. I think we lack shared language, which is a challenge that Lou will talk about as well. And we might worry that we're stepping outside our remit as well as speech and language therapists. But I think it is within our remit as long as it's communication or swallow related. Okay, so I'll stop talking for a moment and I'll stop sharing. And Lou, maybe you can take us from here to talk about your work specific to trans clients, if that's okay. You're just on mute, Lou.
Okay, thank you, Ciarán. So about the transgender clients, my project was focused on them. So first, the literature told us that there are limited evidence that voice congruence is routinely evaluated in clinical settings. So we do have some assessment tools. For example, we have transgender woman voice questionnaire, and we have transgender self-evaluation questionnaire, which inside of the questionnaire, some of the items, they do seem to touch a bit about congruence, but certainly not the main purpose. And another thing is these questionnaire, they were designed to within the binary gender framework at that time. But recent studies have pointed out that binary conceptualization in assessment and healthcare can negatively affect the well-being of transgender people because it could invalidate non-binary identity and also reinforce rigid gender norms. So this highlights that we do need a future tool to adapt more flexible and gender diversity approach to vocal assessment. And as we all know that clinical interview are also considered an important part of the assessment. However, people might ask questions that seem to reflect concerns about congruence, yet because the lack of a clear guidance and clinical emphasis, we cannot be sure whether these questions are actually intended to address congruence or they were actually asking about other issues. And even if they are meant to capture congruence, they remain more conceptual rather than methodological integrated. So we need evidence-based tools that offer greater conceptual clarity and also can be applied consistently and are more inclusive. But since the construct of congruence remains under-theorized in the context of transgender population, so the first step of my research was to do some investigation to better understand it. So that's why my first study in the project was a survey study, and it was designed to understand congruence in trans speech and language therapy from the perspective of both the speech therapist and also the trans clients. And in the study, I had 35 participants in total, and 17 of them were transgender people, and then 18 of them were speech language therapists. Oh, sorry, maybe I should say here, I actually means transgender and gender diverse people because we do include gender diverse people in the survey. So the participants are from different places. They're from Taiwan, they're from US, UK, Canada, and Italy. And then the survey was designed in mixed method way. So we have open-end questions and also closed-end questions. So it's both quantitative and qualitative. The research question for the survey study there were three of them. First is what is the relationship between congruence and also comfort with communication in trans people, and then what factors influence congruence in trans people, and then what is the current state of clinical practice. Okay. And in order to answer the first research question, we designed a few questions like how comfortable do you feel about your voice and communication style, and how much do you feel your voice align with who you are, and how much does it align with social gender norm. So we ran a Spearman correlation, and it reveals that there was a moderate positive correlation between how comfortable and how congruent trans people felt about their voice. And the comfort with voice and communication style was more significantly influenced by congruence than how much TGD people felt their voice was adapted to voice gender norms. So that indicated despite the influence of internal factors. For example, in clinical setting, we often hear the TGD people ask speech therapists, do you think my voice sounds like a man, or do you think my voice sounds like a woman? Or we will hear them describing difficulties related to being misgendered. So all these questions, it feels like it's all about the influence from outside, but actually comfort with voice and communication style is primarily related to vocal congruence with one's sense of self. And I think it's also very similar to my own clinical experience that when someone feels satisfied with their voice and they speak with confidence, the internal evaluation tend to have a much smaller impact on them. I believe this is a psychological state that many of us can relate it to. And for the second research question, we asked people's view on what factors affect vocal and communicative congruence. And there are 5 main things were generated. So these things are voice authenticity and self-consistency, societal pressure and expectation, psychological and physical impact, voice control and adaptability. And the last is voice and gender affirmation through training and practice. So these things could serve as a foundation for the discussion of congruence. And remember that the third question was asking about what the current practice is like. And according to the survey respondents, there were 3 inconsistencies between what the clinician and the clients think. So first, all the speech therapists reported focusing on congruence, but they were 31% of TGD people, they did not feel that the congruence was addressing in their therapy experience. And then participants report a range of emotions. Like some people feel peace and they feel hopeful in discussing congruence, but some people feel discomfort about that. And they are also 2 sides. The 2 sides also have different views on what affects vocal congruence, and also how they prioritize things. So we found this discrepancy in the survey results. But we do not know what caused it. Maybe because it was a survey study, so the participants tend to answer the questions very briefly, or maybe because the difference between two sides, like I have the perspective from the transgender and also from the speech therapist, or maybe it's simply because individual differences. But no matter what's the reasons, it was worth it dig into, because not having a shared understanding could strain the therapeutic relationship and also reduce the impact of intervention, even if the intervention was well intended. So these discrepancies were further explored in my next study, which was a focus group study. And the focus group study were 4 focus groups, and in each groups we have the transgender participants and also speech language therapist, because this was not only to understand each side's priority and also perspective. We also want to see how these priorities and understanding are negotiated between professional and also the trans clients, because this is what happened in a real clinical setting. And the research aims of the focus group study was first to clarify and expand the concept of vocal and communicative congruence by listening to how both sides understand and experience it. And the second was to ask for potential strategies which could support the achievement of congruence in clinical practice. So the findings reveal the speech therapists and transgender people, they do think and describe things in different ways. For example, the word passing. For the speech therapists, they often describe this as the clients trying to align with the societal gender norms or expectations. But for the transgender participants, they tend to frame their motivation through the lens of social recognition and safety concern, and also dysphoria reductions. So we can see that although both perspectives address the desire to be seen and heard in the way that fits the transgender people's need, but they differ in focus. So one is more external conformity, and another one is more internal necessity. And then there are also difference in background knowledge and also background training. So here I'd like to give an example from the group discussion. So in the conversation, people were talking about, I was thinking about the way my voice sounded, which was an item from the vocal congruence scale. So the transgender people start with those who seek speech therapists. They are people obviously quite aware of their voice, and then the speech therapist say that she often feels that she needs to teach the clients how to think about how their voice sounds. But the transgender people respond that many trans clients already think about their voice. They think about it a lot, just not in a help way for them. And like he also point out that this may show a difference between the clinician and the non-clinical perspective. And from this conversation, we can see this is probably where the expertise of speech and language therapy should come in. And in the discussion, people also point out varied lenses and priorities in how voice is evaluated. So first, there is a difference in openness to gender diversity in vocal expression. So some people, they believe and expect that trans gender people should sound like cisgender people. So they think that trans women are expected to sound like cisgender women in order to count as women. But like this is like something feel like very rigid, but there are also people, they say that voice is a highly diverse and personal thing, and there's no single correct way to sound feminine, masculine, or non-binary. And then people also take different stands about vocal identity. Some people see voice as a direct reflection of gender identity, while others frame it as encompassing broader elements of self-expression. So it reflects in the discussion. Some people think that the items from the vocal congruence scale, my voice reflected my gender and my voice belongs to me, are similar things. And there are transgender people say that for most of us, gender is usually something we care a lot. Like they would put gender in front of who they are. So they think gender first. But there are also speech therapists mentioned that she had a lot of clients say that, oh, now people do perceive me as female or they perceive me as male, but I still don't feel like my voice sounds natural or it doesn't feel like me. So this capture like how people think, like how they address vocal identity differently. So now we know how the discrepancy may have come from. The last question is, how do we address this difference? So first, in the focus group, people talk about communication. Like this was the topic that was brought up the most. So we need to have shared language and mutual understanding. And they mentioned about negotiation and flexibility in goal setting, and also emotional safety and support in therapeutic relationship were very important. And people also talk about working with so they talk about speech therapists reflective and rational ethics in professional practice. Also the needs for interdisciplinary support, especially working with psychotherapists. And I think this is my lecture. Thank you. Let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Lou. Yeah, so I'll just go back to sharing again for a moment. Excuse me. So Lou has spoken so far about congruence and differences in perspectives between speech therapists and trans people, and how trans people experience congruence or incongruence. I've been supervising one of our undergraduate students this year, Ella Burden, one of our final year students, and Ella and I did a project on people who are survivors of head and neck cancer to look at congruence in this cohort. So I just wanted to give a slightly different perspective on congruence because in Lou's situation, I suppose there's a group of people who probably generally speaking have a healthy voice but are seeking to change their communication style. In people with head and neck cancer who've been through radiotherapy treatment, it's a group of people who had a voice that probably felt authentic to them, and then that voice was potentially taken away from them. So before Lou comes back and speaks about some solutions that she's devised, I just wanted to share the experiences from this study. So the study was carried out because Ella and I both recognize that radiotherapy is known to adversely affect voice. But what we don't know is to what extent congruence is affected by these changes in voice, whether it's related to self-perceived functional impact in terms of what you can do with your voice every day, or whether it's related to self-perceived voice quality. So what we did was Ella developed an online survey of individuals who were, after having either radiotherapy or chemoradiotherapy. These were individuals who were recruited online through support groups, but at also some clinical sites, including St. Luke's Radiation Oncology Network and the Royal Victoria Eye Hospital and James's. And we're very grateful to those sites for helping us. And I'm sorry if I've forgotten any other sites. And the participants in this research completed online the vocal congruence scale, the voice handicap index 10 as a measure of functional activity. And then they also had several slider bars, but the one I'm going to focus on is one that asked them to self-rate their own vocal quality from 0 to 100, best, no changes at all, to worst. And we were looking at the relationships between these. So let's just have a look at what we found. Excuse me. There were 47 valid responses. There were more than that, but 47 valid responses, fully completed responses, with participants who had a post-treatment duration from less than 1 month ago to more than 2 years ago. 85% of respondents had voice changes after radiotherapy. That's quite a lot, but perhaps not unusual, particularly considering the high prevalence of it, but also the fact that people who had voice changes were probably more motivated to take the survey in the first place. Amongst the participants, half of participants were avoiding voice-related activities due to changes in their voice. And just 43% had been seen by a speech and language therapist for voice. We asked about voice specifically rather than dysphagia or anything at all. So for voice work, 43% were seen by an SLT. If we look at the scores overall, in the vocal congruence scale, the median score was 21. And this is on a scale that goes from 0, which is the highest degree of incongruence, to 40, the highest degree of congruence. So being halfway between the two, I think there's sort of a moderate level of incongruence there. The voice handicap index is similarly a scale from 0 to 40, and the median score was 16. And the voice quality slider was also 50. So pretty much all three scores halfway down the line from least to most impact. The confusing grid of values at the bottom, if you're not a statistics nerd like me, I'll explain them very briefly. If we read across the top row, so vocal congruence scores were not related to functional impact statistically by that p-value, 0.127, but very much related to voice quality. So in this group of people, it did seem as though voice quality was related very strongly with congruence. So as your voice quality got worse, your congruence got worse as well. And then in terms of voice handicap index, that was also related to voice quality. And have I missed any other scores? But voice handicap index, yes, was not related to vocal congruence. So what does this tell us? In people with head and neck cancer, there was a moderate level, I would say, informally, of vocal impairment and functional impact through VHI and incongruence in this group of people. Congruence was unrelated to functional impact, but very strongly related to impaired voice quality, where incongruence rose alongside the extent of impairment of voice quality. Functional impact was also strongly associated with increasing levels of vocal impairment, self-perceived vocal impairment through the slider. And therefore, I think clinicians should evaluate functional and identity-related challenges in those post-radiotherapy, particularly in those with poor self-perceived voice quality. In other words, we can say your voice is now more dysphonic than it was before the radiotherapy, and let's do some work on trying to improve your voice quality. But perhaps we should also be asking people, well, how does this make you feel about how you are as a person? You know, has your personality changed? Do you feel like you're perceived differently by other people? And what does it make you think about that? So that's just briefly the results of that study. I'm going to hand back over to Lou now, because Lou is going to focus more so now on what we should be doing to manage this better in clinical practice as a result of the findings from both her study and mine. Lou, would you want to share again?
Sure, thank you, Ciarán. This is also the first time that I hear you talk about your project, like the study. It was very interesting. Okay, so I know that we talk a lot about addressing congruence in speech and language therapy, but does everyone need it? And also, how and when could or should we introduce congruence during assessment? So to answer this, I'd like to show you a comment from one of the studies in my project. It was actually the last study of my project. So the participants say that I tend to always assume I'm failing with my voice and that nothing is ever good enough, which is perhaps an unhealthy pattern of thought associated with gender incongruence. I noticed that my speech therapists sometimes have been pointing out that my voice is quite good, but I struggle to view it from their perspective. So for me, this was quite an informative statement because, well, it illustrates that like there are many factors that can deeply influence self-perception. For example, something like gender identity and self-esteem could affect how people see, hear, and perceive themselves. And also how challenging it could be to break the negative thoughts pattern and to accept positive feedback, especially when those patterns are linked to broader issues of identity. And sometimes people, they do recognize their struggles, but they may feel trapped in them, like in this case. And another times people experience distress, but they are unable to identify the reasons behind it. In either situation, there is a clear need for continued support, patience, and strategies to build self-compassion and reshape how they view their own voice. And, well, I think that's when and where the discussion of vocal congruence should come in. So the final outcome of my PhD project is a vocal and communicative conversation toolkit. So in this toolkit, I wanted to introduce vocal and communicative congruence as a concept that can help both the clinicians and the clients understand how individuals view their own voice. And I also wanted to show how integrating congruence into therapy can support patients in developing a healthier and more neutral relationship with their voice. So this is how the toolkit looks like. I have 10 topics within the toolkit, and first I will introduce the topic and then I'll show the descriptions, basically to that the client and also the clinician to have a better idea about what we're going to talk about. And there are a few questions listed under the topic to help initiate the discussion around it. Okay. So the desired outcome of addressing congruence or use this conversational toolkit is to expand understanding of voice that could support clients in reshaping how they evaluate and conceptualize their own voice. And also, of course, like Ciarán talked about how congruence is linked with the interoceptive sensitivities. So we want to develop greater interoceptive sensitivities and also to build confidence and also trust in positive, healthier, and more authentic way of thinking about voice through the experience of voice therapy, speech language therapy. So here I want to quote the what the transgender clients said in the group discussion. So this one is actually followed the discussion of I was thinking about how I was sounded. So in conclusion, the transgender people were saying that, oh, you need to guide them into helpful and like useful way of thinking. I guess it's very nicely captured the why do we need speech and language therapy, because it is possible to change the voice, but changing one's relationship with their voice is the therapeutic part. So now I'm going to give the time back to Ciarán.
Great. Thank you, Lou. So just to wrap up then in that case, final thoughts. I think I would argue, certainly, I didn't run this by Lou before I put it on a slide, but I think that congruence is something that should not be optional. In terms of, we don't have to actively do something about it all the time, but I think we need to be thinking about it all the time with our clients. It depends on the client group you're working with. And maybe if someone comes to you and they're simply saying, look, forget about how I feel about my voice. I just want my voice to sound better. That's a clear-cut case of that person simply wants to work on the impairment, and I think that's okay. If that's a traditional muscle tension voice disorder client who, just needs their voice for their job and wants to get better, I think that's fairly straightforward. But for certain client groups, I think we should even ask a question. How does your voice make you feel, or what do you think about your voice and how it reflects your personality? Or indeed, Lou's toolkit, once it's published, use that as well to generate some prompts. I think as well, congruence is not a concept that's owned by either speech and language therapists or clients. Lou took a very interesting approach, which I don't know that you explicitly mentioned in the presentation, Lou, but you did mention that you recruited both speech therapists and transgender and gender diverse people as part of your research. And your ethos from the very beginning was, well, we don't own this as speech therapists. It's a common thing that we need to be addressing both as clients and clinicians, and having an equitable conversation about. And I think that that's really valuable. I think that addressing congruence is an ethical responsibility as much as a technical one. It's not just another, I need to complete the vocal congruence scale now alongside the VHI and other things. It's something that we need to think about to deliver ethical care, I think, to our clients. We should be addressing psychosocial distress or unease in all aspects, including incongruence. And then I think start with a conversation about it. That's the easiest thing to do. It's what we do best as speech and language therapists. We're experts in communication. So talk to your clients and ask them about how they feel. I'm going to finish with a quote that Lou had at the very beginning of her PhD. So this is credit to Lou and not me. I really enjoyed this quote by Audre Lorde, who is an activist, poet, philosopher, writer, many other things, who said, if I didn't define myself for myself, I'd be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. And I think that was a very powerful quote and very relevant to Lou's work with trans people. I think we need to be doing more to help empower our clients to speak up for who they are for themselves, rather than who we want them to be necessarily, or who others want them to be. So there's a reference list there, but perhaps we'll go to questions, Paul, if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ciarán and Lou, for that really, really expansive and interesting talk. Maybe we have a few minutes, and maybe I'll kick us off. I mean, I was interested in, you mentioned the congruence scale, and I was that got me thinking about whether we need to refine towards kind of specific congruence scales for specific client groups, or do you feel that there's something more sort of broad and inclusive where the same kind of measures can be applied to different client groups?
I'll answer first, if you don't mind, Lou, and then I'll happily let you answer as well. But in my opinion, I think it's a universal experience, and I think that the scale asks broad enough questions that it would suit any client group. And we did sort of focus on that, myself and Ella, during the head and neck cancer study, to make sure that this wasn't a trans-specific scale that we're administering with another group of people. So I think it's a universal experience, and a scale that captures that universal experience, it works well. But what do you think, Lou?
Well, for the skill itself, it was developed in a way that it could capture all the group, not just within a certain group. And because of that, me and Ciarán, we've done the study, used that. And also for the final outcome of my project, like I know that like we developed a conversational toolkit, like now mainly for transgender clients, but there are also questions that we think it could apply for many group. So because this vocal and communicative congruence, I think it's not belong to certain group, like even like people like us, we can reflect our communication and our voice very frequently.
Sure, lovely, thank you. So there's a couple of comments in the Q&A there. Emma says thank you for the brilliant talk. Hissa says thank you as well. She asks the question, when a client's voice is technically healthy but feels incongruent to them, whose judgment should carry the most weight? The clinicians, the clients? Standardized measures and do tools like the VHI adequately capture vocal incongruence?
Yeah, I think my view would be that the clients' perspectives carry more weight in that situation. I think tools like VHI don't capture vocal incongruence. They're designed to measure functional impact in terms of activities of daily living and what you can and can't do. I think to some extent they do ask about my voice makes me feel. There are some questions that are emotional, and that gets near congruence, but it doesn't quite address congruence in the VHI. But the first half of the question, whose judgment carries the most weight when the voice technically sounds fine? I think, I think the clients, but I suppose when I think about it a little more, it has to be a conversation with the client about, well, why do you feel like that? Because that might be when we need to start introducing counseling skills and saying, well, are you being fair to yourself in that situation? That would be my perspective on it. What do you think, Lou?
Well, the definition of voice disorder starts from how the person itself the person themselves think about their voice. So I do feel that the client's perspective is probably value the most, like in the beginning of the assessment, because they do come to the therapist with their difficulties, and that's when we need to sit down and listen to them carefully, because the answer is usually in their own answers. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah. So Carol's asked a question about a laryngectomy client who's a proficient tracheoesophageal speaker, and when they were given a hands-free valve, they said this was the first time that they could talk, as they could move their hands, and this was kind of a late realization. So congruence was only revealed through the therapeutic options, really. So I suppose that's a bit like your comment, Ciarán, about it being the start of a dialogue. There's something quite dynamic going on here over time, potentially.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it speaks as well to the importance of nonverbal communication in what we do as well. I do remember, I hope Rachel Moore is a friend and colleague of mine who worked in the gender service until recently. And I remember she told me something once that really stuck with me about a client she saw who was a transmasculine client, and sounded for all intents and purposes quite masculine, and but still felt like something was missing. And Rachel looked at body language, and when he was sitting, she said once he sat back like this in quite a typical male fashion, he said, "Oh, that's it. It's the way I'm sitting. It's the way I'm holding myself. That's the issue." I think that sounds like it parallels Carol's experience a little as well. It's not just about the verbal; it's also about the meta, the suprasegmental and the meta as well.
Great, lovely, thank you. I think we'll wrap up there. There are no more questions, and just to thank Ciarán and Lou very much for your fantastic contribution today. So we'll continue with our monthly arrangement and plans for the first Thursday. So that will mean that in March we have a session on the 5th of March at lunchtime, 1 o'clock. That'll be led by our colleague Amy Connery on preschool disfluency, and then on the 2nd of April, the next session will be about communicative support strategies around adult acquired disorders. So yes, so just to say thanks again to Ciarán and Lou, and we look forward to seeing you again really soon. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ciarán. Thank you, everybody.